My wife and I go back to Pittsburgh once a year, once every other year. She's from Pittsburgh originally, and this is what Pittsburgh looks like on a bright sunny day. And this is during the 1940s, a typical day during the day with the street lights on. A lot of rainy days, but also a lot of days mixed with clouds of soot that came from the steel mills in Pittsburgh. What about today? Now you think about the Steelers from Pittsburgh, you think about the football Steelers that play at Heinz Stadium right by the Allegheny River. When you think of the Steelers, you can get romantic and you think about all the steel that was made back in the day in Pittsburgh. But like a lot of things in history, there's more to the story than just the romantic thoughts about the past. There's a lot involved. So coming back to the present, my wife wanted to do some shopping, and there are a lot of shopping areas where there used to be steel mills along the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh, especially on the south side. So that's what we did, but I let her go shopping, and she said, why don't you go walk over by the river and see if there's somewhere to walk along the river there, and then we'll meet back up and go from there. So that's what I did. And the first thing I came across were goats along the river. And here's a whole family of them just sort of chilling out in the sun after they've eaten their way across the area, very narrow strip between a fence that on one side is a bicycle path and the other side is the river. And this sign says that they're happy there. And it also warns you to not touch the fence because it's electric. And it's along a 4-story tall townhouse development that is along the road that goes parallel to the river. And they even have a putting green at the end of the development, something I've always wanted to have in my yard. So it got interesting to see some historic relics. First, this bridge, which I don't know if it's still in operation or not. It could be, but I didn't see any trains go over it while I was there. That went across the Monongahela. And it kind of is of the same vintage as the Hot Metal Bridge, which I did a previous video on, riding over this bridge, which is a remnant from the steel foundries that were on both sides of the river. And this bridge was actually used to transport molten steel from one side of the river to the other because the process was so long that they needed both sides of the river to do everything they had to do to make steel. And also along the south side of the river are these huge brick smokestacks. When you read about it, they're not actually smokestacks. They were just ventilation stacks for the hot air to rise up out of the factory. And this is what the factory still looked like in 1980. And there's all those brick smokestacks, if you will. And another remnant that was just amazing to me as I continued walking around, and this is located in the back of a Lowe's parking lot where they store all the outdoor stuff, but there's this huge press that I guess it was so big that they couldn't really move it. It would take a lot of effort to dismantle it and take it away. And why not just leave it for some people like me to come along, read the sign about it, and just be amazed that such a thing was involved in the whole steel making process. So that's what you see a lot of on the south side of Pittsburgh are things that were maybe so big that they didn't want to bother removing them, but also they've left them to sort of remind people of what used to be there before the shopping centers and the hotels and whatnot were built in this area. Used to all be steel plants. And here's a close-up of that gantry crane, just ginormous. And even in our hotel, they had a smaller thing that they could fit in the lobby of the hotel, but it's from another steel foundry in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. But it's just everywhere. So this is the area I'm talking about where I put the star on the map. We're on the south side of the Monongahela River, a little east of downtown Pittsburgh. We're across the river from the Oakland section, which is where the universities are. University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon. Also, if you go northeast, the Squirrel Hill neighborhood is a nice residential area, and Point Breeze, which I'll talk about a little bit later, also a very nice area. And there were just steel plants everywhere. This is from a sign that I came across as I was walking around, just to show you all the different factories that not only went along the Monongahela River, and this is just in Pittsburgh proper, they went down the river out into outer towns and also up the Allegheny and along the Ohio. There were steel plants everywhere. So getting back to the area, the south side, where there were a lot of plants, I've indicated here also the neighborhoods of Braddock and Homestead, which also have relics, which I'll show on the Homestead side. And I also show on this map where the head of the whole process lived, Frick, who was Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man. And he lived in the Point Breeze neighborhood, which I mentioned before. And he would go to work in downtown Pittsburgh in the Frick building. So he went from the Frick mansion to the Frick building. I don't know how many times he went down to the plants themselves down along the river, but he was the man who ran the show, made a lot of money doing so. So here's another plant that was in the area. This plant actually was used to make machinery that was used in the steel plants. So it was right in the middle of all the other steel plants, and it emitted less smoke, but it was still a gigantic operation. And look at all the train tracks that were along the river back in the day, not to mention barge traffic. And here's, again, what the steel foundries look like. They did emit a lot of smoke. So one of the things is I had a lot of questions from seeing these various artifacts that are still left along the river that speak to the former steel industry. And I've always been curious about Pittsburgh. You hear good things about it, but you look at the census data and it's continued to lose population. It's lost population every decade since the 1950s when it peaked. So even more recently, it's still dropped by 1% between 2010 and 2020. And overall, looking at the population change from 2000 to 2020, Pittsburgh is one of a dozen large American cities that have lost population. And I did another video about the growing cities of North Dakota, Grand Forks and Fargo, which were on the positive side. They had increased in population between 2000 and 2020 by like 20 to 40%. But these are all cities that have lost population during that same time period, and Pittsburgh's right in the middle of the pack. So going back to that bridge, that rail bridge, it was right in this area that I started to see and read a lot about the history of the steel industry. And one thing you start reading about, and they have signage that describes what went on, but the year 1892 was a real rough year for Pittsburgh, one of a couple of rough years. And that bridge that I showed going across the Monongahela, that I don't know whether it's still operating or not, here it is back in the 1890s. And here are a lot of steel workers that are upset that they're being told that their wages are being cut and their work weeks are being lengthened, and they're not happy about it. They're not getting paid that much to begin with. So they're lining up to battle with some private security people that are being brought in by the steel companies to break up this strike that they were starting. And you read all about it. At this former pump house, which is still standing, there's signage at this pump house along the Monongahela River that tells you about the battle and how it sort of is a key place that represents the Union movement in the U.S. And it talks about the battle and the ramifications of that. So 1892, it seems like a long time ago, but it really wasn't that long ago. And here is a picture of that pump house in 1892. And it's a lot higher up from the river than it seems like now. It's been more built up since then. So the people sitting here along the road going down to the pump house, they could be workers or they could be whole families that maybe on the one day the workers had off. What do? They just go right back to near the steel foundry that they work at just to look at the river and have something to do. So back to that pump house building. Here it is today. This is right near where the battle ensued. And this plaque talks about the battle. It got really up in arms and 10 people were killed, including some of the security agents, Pinkerton guards that were hired by the company, and workers that were killed. Pretty violent. And here are a lot of the workers that are rallying around, very upset. I think they've got some family family members that are joining in also. And if you look at the wording above the doorway, it's in German. And I tried to translate it, but the word Sanger does not come up, so I don't have a complete translation. But Eintracht means harmony. Well, there was not a whole lot of harmony on this day in 1892. And now, when you look across the river, you do still see one of the steel plants. It's the one remaining plant in the city of Pittsburgh. This one is no longer operating. It was operating during 1892. It had been operating for 8 years at that point because it began operations 1884 and went almost 100 years to 1982. And it's been left there. They have tours of it. I need to go back and see the next time we go back to Pittsburgh. And here's that same plant in the 1950s. There's no trees growing up around it back then. It's in full operation. And this just compares that romanticized picture that I showed earlier of the Cary furnaces in 1900 versus kind of more the stark reality of what it is to have a steel foundry in operation. So one of the things that I had to study a lot when I was in school, for some reason, our teachers felt that we kids in Illinois needed to understand the steel making process. I'm sure kids don't study this anymore. And we learned about how coal is turned into coke and it's used in the process, and iron is turned into steel. And we probably went through it several years when I was in grade school, and it never really completely sunk in. And even looking at this chart now that's trying to explain things, it still is a mystery to me. I still would like to actually go to an operating steel plant and see how everything gets put together to make steel. And another question I had is, with all these steel plants gone, what happened to the U.S. steel industry? Is all of our steel made abroad or what? But in fact, no, the steel that was produced in the early 1900s is much less than what has been produced since. And while it did peak in the 1970s, there's still a lot of steel that's made and that's produced and that's needed. And this chart that I found shows that no, a lot of it isn't from imports. Some of it is, decent percentage is, but most of our steel is still produced in the U.S. And going on to read more about the steel industry, it's sort of done the reverse of other industries, let's say like the car industry, which once had a lot of smaller plants that consolidated into big plants in Detroit and other parts of the Midwest. The steel industry, which used to be concentrated primarily in Pittsburgh, but also in Cleveland and Gary, Indiana. There are now more plants, but they're smaller and more spread out. So it's the opposite of consolidation. But the demand for steel continues, and it continues to be produced in the U.S. Now, one thing that is happening, or has happened, and continues to happen, is that there are less and less people employed in the steel industry. Why? Because technology keeps making it so that there are less and less people that need to be involved in the process. So you can blame bringing in imports from outside of the U.S., but really the main thing that's been affecting and bringing down the employment levels in the steel industry, like a lot of manufacturing industries, is technology, making things more and more efficient with less and less people. So going back to some of these remnants, which I found so interesting. These are huge ladles, or they call them bells, that were involved in the process. And again, they've described it in the informational sign on the left, but I'd really need to see it as part of the overall process to understand how these bells worked in the process. But they're just gigantic. And here's another view of them with that rail bridge in the background that was in the background of the battle that went on between the striking workers and the company's security people. And this is just a rusty old stairway that used to go down to the river from near the pump house, now closed off. And near the pump house is a water tower where they stored the water. And also it has a U.S. Steel sign that honors the employees that used to work at the Homestead foundry. And it's also got a decent restroom inside. This shows back in the day the train tracks that went by that are no longer right there with the water tower and the pump house. And here's a picture of what it looked like from across the river when the plant in the background was still there. The plant is gone, and now it's just the pump house and the water tower. This just shows you the overall shopping area where the plant was located. It's now called the Waterfront Town Square and the Waterfront Shopping Center next to the neighborhood of Homestead that the plant was named after. And when you stop and read some of the informational signage, this is by that huge press. It shows or attempts to show how it was used when it was in operation. Very hot in there. This is before OSHA. I guess the workers didn't have to wear shirts, much less hard hats. They talk about that it was a 12,000-ton press, and the steel from here was used to make battleships. And a lot of the steel was just used for structural beams that go into the skyscrapers of every major American city. So steel that came from the Homestead Works went on to be used in the building of the Empire State Building, the Sears Tower in Chicago, the St. Louis Gateway Arch, as well as the U.S. Steel Building in Pittsburgh. Here's that huge press again, and it's located, as I mentioned, in the back of a Lowe's parking lot. If you want to find it, look for the Lowe's store and then go in the back. Now, I mentioned 1892 was a rough year for Pittsburgh, and it wasn't the only rough year back in the day. The year 1877 was another point in time when the railroads also did a thing like the steel industry. They wanted to cut the workers' wages, and the workers were not happy about that. So what did they do? They set fire to the old Pennsylvania train station, and they really got carried away. They set fire to a lot of the train cars that were parked in the yard at the station, so it caused a lot of damage. Looks like the end of World War II afterwards. Takes a long time to rebuild from something like that. I talk about that fire at the old Penn Station and the new Penn Station that was built decades later after that in another video about Pittsburgh's train stations. So winding up, after doing a little more historical research and also visiting the Frick Mansion, which is a very nice place to take a visit. We had a very interesting tour of the interior of the house, and it all is tied together with what went on by the river and the average worker versus the well-off executive. Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick were two of the main guys, if not the two main guys, in the steel industry in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they got together, they merged their companies and became one, and then ultimately that company became U.S. Steel, which was founded right after the turn of the century in 1901. The last thing I'll just mention here before I'll show a final video clip of the Frick Mansion is when there was all that labor unrest down at the plant, there was one anarchist guy who thought he would try to solve the situation himself, and he went to Henry Clay Frick's office at the Frick building and he shot him several times, but they wrestled him to the ground. Henry Clay Frick lived, and the perpetrator, Alexander Berkman, was sent away to prison for a long time. He ultimately was released. So let me show you the Frick Mansion, and that'll conclude this video. Thanks for watching.
Now further upriver are these huge leftover brick smokestacks, and it's now in a shopping, restaurant, retail complex, and they got to have a historical plaque here that talks about these. Let me go find it. Isn't this something? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's a dozen huge brick smokestacks. And I think it's cool just walking down the line here. I'll find that plaque. As I walk down to the end to try to find some sort of historic plaque, oh, here's a plaque. But this Monongahela River is right over here, sort of right before the hills rise up. And so there's some hotels along the river, in addition to the movie theater complex. And there's a steakhouse here. We're on this Homestead section of Pittsburgh. And downtown Pittsburgh is where I'm pointing the camera. All right, let me just focus in on this. This is what these smokestacks were too. And there's a huge plant that would be behind us, and train tracks. And even Nikita Khrushchev, when he was the premier of Russia, came here in 1959. It's just amazing to me that this whole area was a steel plant. The whole scale of it was just immense. Everything was huge. From the plant to the steel that they made. And now we're looking at another part of where the plant was, or plants. And now it's a big bucks retail center. And I'll show you something here at the end. It's in the back of a Lowe's store way at the end. But it's a huge press that they used as part of the steel foundry. So here in the back of this Lowe's is this 12,000 ton press. I just found it amazing. Just gigantic. So they would take sort of semi-formed steel and then press it into the shapes that they needed to. They said when it operated, the earth shook in the whole neighborhood. You can just imagine the force. Just amazing. In the back of a Lowe's parking lot. Brick mansion site, and it says the grounds are closed, but the gate's open. Let's see if I can walk in here to take a picture of the Frick's house. You can sort of see it through the trees there. We came here yesterday and took a tour of the house, and you're not allowed to take pictures in the house. But this is like a little former caretaker's cottage. It's now a restaurant, and they had a greenhouse. And this house here was a playhouse for the kids. The whole house. And here's the Henry Frick mansion. And he took an existing house and expanded it, they were telling us. And so people would pull in. I don't know where the original driveway was. Maybe it was where the pathway is now. And park their cars or their horse-drawn buggies under the portico. Or you could call it a porte cochere. And we could take a tour of the first floor and the second floor, not the third floor. So it was really elegant and sumptuous on the inside, but this is considered a small mansion compared to some of the other mansions that were in Pittsburgh at the time. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Fricks, but I just wanted to show you where they lived here in Breezy Point in Pittsburgh. Beautiful grounds. Just a little closer look at their greenhouse. And the kids' playhouse.